on the Communicators, a discussion with the new head of the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, former FCC Chairman Michael Powell. This interview was done at the NCTA Cable Show in Chicago.
We are on the floor of your convention in Chicago with quite a bit of excitement over your shoulder here. This is your first in the new role for you as the head of the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, the industry's trade group. What's it like coming to the show in this capacity versus your old role as a regulator?
It's very different. You know, I've been to many of these shows as a guest or a speaker, and you don't realize the half of what it goes into putting it on. It's an extraordinary undertaking done by a staff who's been committed to it. For 20 or 30 years, the same group has worked on putting it together. And I told my wife the other day, I feel like it's like running for president or something. You're scheduled every 3 minutes. But it is really our premier window on the world, you know, and so it's very exciting. How many jobs come with their own show? It really is a chance to tell the story. And so I'm having a ball with it, but it's very, very, very different.
This is a trade show, not a consumer show. So,
yeah.
So many of the people in our audience will not have any sense of what goes on here. What's the theme for this business right now as you walk around this floor?
Well, I think our sort of advertising theme is everything possible, but I think the real story is cable's really beginning to open the book on the next chapter in its history, right? We've all watched for over a decade now technological evolution and different iterations of interesting things that are really coming to the home or coming to new devices. And it's really been a while since we were sort of getting ready to see the cable home experience take that next generational leap. And so the big theme we're seeing is, put a short way, is sort of cable moving to software. And what I mean by that is you're seeing the notion of app stores and app environments being moved into the cable space. You're seeing content being able to be ported to the kind of consumer devices that consumers love, iPads, iPhones, all of that stuff. You're beginning to see new services that can be layered on top of those platforms in the cloud and be moved around on local Wi-Fi networks. And so we've heard stuff like that in a visionary way for a long time, but you're really starting to see actual product build now. And so, you know, it's funny you say this is a trade show and not a consumer show, but that distinction's starting to blur because consumer equipment is so powerful and consumers are becoming so increasingly sophisticated about their own digital interactions that it is a trade show, but more and more I think it has a retail component. It's about what the consumer is going to get next.
I want to pick up on that theme, and I wrote down some of the words you used in one of your speeches here and have you explain a little bit more what you were thinking. You described this, and I'm paraphrasing, as a time of great promise, but also ambiguity and anxiety.
Yeah.
What are you suggesting there?
You know, I think there's this amazing quality to transformational moments, and I think we're still in a transformational moment from a technology standpoint. You know, a few years ago, none of us ever heard of Facebook. A few years ago, none of us saw an iPhone or a smartphone. You know, a few years before that, we never envisioned a music service broken down into its component parts and my kids being their own record producers. And so everybody gets very excited about what those new tools mean for the possibility of new products and services. And so in one sense, there's this sense of infinite possibility. But it's also real uncertainty. If you have a traditional business and you've been very, very successful in your traditional business, and you start to feel the heat of the need to innovate and change, that's anxiety producing. And it's an ambiguity because you're not always 100% sure where it's going or whether it'll be profitable to go there, or whether consumers will respond because you're creating new markets and new opportunities. But yet you also know you can't stand still, right? If you sit still in this market, you'll get killed. You'll get killed just standing there. The path of companies is littered with companies that really sat and missed disruptive change and then never could quite catch up. And you know, business case books are full of those stories. So yeah, it's a period of anxiety, ambiguity, and there'll be more we don't know than we do know. And it'll spill into public policy too. You'll have a glimpse of a problem, and you'll have a whole lot of hypotheticals and speculation about is it a real problem or not, and you have to work your way through at this sort of discomforting level of not being entirely sure what the next turn is.
In your role as the head of the NCTA, I mean, so much of this is is technology dependent and the generation of new ideas and technology. Do you see yourself bridging some alliances between groups that historically have had some friction in the past, such as the equipment manufacturers, with your members?
I do. I think that one of the things I love about NCTA, which is part of what attracted to me, it's still one of the great associations that really includes all of the components of its ecosystem. You know, we have big programmers, we have small programmers, we have major programming networks, we have independent programming networks, we have affiliates, equipment providers, services, and there's tensions in those relationships at times, as there would and has to be whenever you're going through an evolution. But what I like about the cable industry, and it's fairly committed to this, is it wants to be solution oriented rather than being shrill. And part of the objective in doing that is how much of our own problems can we solve in-house? If we have a dispute or a concern, can we bring it to our table first? And not have a full instinct to go to the FCC or go to the Hill or use the regulatory process to sort of punitively disrupt our competitors. We try to reserve our public policy issues for things that are really problematic to our ability to continue to run the businesses. And so, yeah, I do think that one of the reasons they wanted me and one of the reasons it was easy to attract me is that I think they're very, very sincere about, in addition to just the public policy components of the job, to really help be an ambassador and a diplomat among the various constituencies and try to bridge those gaps.
One of the biggest changes in that regard is depicted right over your shoulder. Excuse me, because I see the big NBC Universal sign, which is now part of the Comcast family.
Yeah.
Broadcasters and cable companies have gone head to head for years. Now it's all in one company at that board table for you. How does that change the policy discussions?
Well, it's a great question because we don't entirely know yet. I mean, I think it's a fantastic company. They've made a bold move. They themselves have to work through that also internally first. You know, now they have all kinds of components within a company, reporting to a common boss, but lots of historical different, you know, divisions and focuses. And, you know, I know Brian's working very hard on the integration inside the company, and we'll see and we'll react to how they begin to propagate their interest. But in many ways, it changes the dynamic inside the association, but I think on net for the better, right? You have the country's largest operator, also a significant programmer, and you know it provides us you know, no real alternative. We are an association that now is really bound together, as we should have been anyway. But I think Comcast helps makes that you know, real glue, because you know you're going to have them, and they're going to be both, and that just means we have to put all of those issues on the table, no matter what, and we have to work through them. So. It's interesting.
Sounds like some interesting board meetings.
It's going to be some interesting board meetings.
Let me get into a few issues with you, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Let me start with this morning interesting session you had where you interviewed the current FCC chair, Julius Jankowski, and among those he talked about broadband's 3 gaps.
Yeah.
One is availability, the other is spectrum, and the third is adoption. I want to spend a little more time with each. The availability, that's been an issue that's been of real interest to you personally in your career.
Always.
An aspect of that, it's like the last 7%, 10% of people in this country. What are the impediments of getting a broadband service to that last 7% of Americans?
You know, it's a great question, because if you looked at the history of the country and its deployment of infrastructure, it's always this problem, right? You can create an economic service up to a certain point. And then the country's density, the country's, you know, diversity of mobility, affordability, you begin to hit this, it's kind of, you know, not to be geeky, but it's kind of like an asymptote. You know, you get closer and closer, but there's that last gap that's really, really hard. Part of the reason it's hard is geography. You know, we are still a very vast country with rural, you know, big rural parts of the population where you can wire one home and the next home is 20 miles away. That's a lot of infrastructure for 2 potential households. That's always a problem. Sometimes it's affordability. This problem is even more complex, because we're finding that it's not just access to the infrastructure or just affordability. It's also a brand new and not fully appreciated service in lots of quarters of the country, right? Why do I need broadband? Why is it important? It's something Chairman Jankowski is very focused on. And I think in time people will see that value. But as a country that's trying to make a transition to the knowledge economy, in an information age, right, it actually becomes an economic imperative that if that's going to be the engine that drives growth and productivity, it's not going to be very effective if you have 2/3 of your citizens that aren't plugged into it. So I do think it's really important. But look, fundamentally, it's an economic problem, right? It's infrastructure, cost of infrastructure to build it. And there have been some efforts for the government to help subsidize that. Or Chairman Janikowski's focus on reforming universal service is in essence an effort to transform that set of subsidies toward broadband, which might possibly lower down the problem. But then you're going to have the continuing problem of operating the service, right? We get all the infrastructure out there, and the same 2 homes are still only $100 a month in revenue.
Right.
So I think that's all actually, at the end of the day, the toughest part, right? Even how long have we had phone service? Close to 100 years. It's also not 100% subscription, right? I mean, it's probably more like 96% subscription. So there'll probably be always some core thing that's very hard to crack. But I think we're right as a country to say, can't we move that a lot closer? And aren't we collectively committed to that?
I'm going to poke around a little bit more about
Sure.
this because rural living always has trade-offs.
Yes.
There are not airports that serve every rural citizen, bus service, et cetera. What is it that might be special about broadband that the country should spend the resources to make the extra effort?
I think that's a really great question. I think part of it is, number one, we're a country committed to fairness. And I think there's an inequality of opportunity. And I think there's some recognition that more than a convenience, this is something that is in a category of more than a convenience, more than a luxury. It may be an indispensable element of our educational crisis, an indispensable element of job opportunity. It may be an indispensable element to domestic global productivity. It may be the critical key to healthcare reform, which is going to bankrupt the country if we don't create new efficiencies. So I think there is, speaking collectively for all of us who say we care, I think there's a sense that the entire country's well-being needs to be able to use these tools as a way of handling major national problems. So when we start saying, why do 25% of kids drop out of high school in the United States, in the information age? When we start saying, how do I make healthcare cheaper? Or we're going to bankrupt the country over healthcare costs. Or the next problem, It's really great if you can make an assumption that you can try to solve that problem through an infrastructure that you have some reasonable basis to assume the majority of your citizens have. And I think that's the answer. And I think communications is just something uniquely different.
The related gap is in the adoption area. So the numbers are about 67%.
Yeah.
About 100 million households that are still not,
Roughly,
and it's not that they can't get it, it's that they're not using it.
Yes.
And I just wonder about the individual freedom and right to say no.
I think it's a great, fair question. I mean, if I were being honest, I would say, which I'm always trying to be, but look, there is a limit on this, right? I mean, it is not government's role, and it's not my role to tell a free-thinking American who doesn't want to subscribe to a service that they have to subscribe to service. I mean, we shouldn't be paternalistic about this to the extent of being really overly preachy about it. I do think that there are probably people in that percentage who've made a very rational, conscious choice for themselves and for their family, or they look at their own disposable income budget and say, in our family, we value these things more, and this is about our personal values, and we prefer to spend our money this way. And I think we better always be careful to recognize that and make room for that. I think that being said, the gap is so significant that I think and people have surveyed and looked at this enough to believe that there are some things that we think that would drive more adoption that are in the realm of better education, more infrastructure, better affordability. Let's at least make sure that someone's not on because they've made the choice you're suggesting, and not on just because they're not digitally sufficiently literate, or they don't have the infrastructure at all, so they don't really have a choice to make, or they can't afford a computer, so it's not even one of the choices available.
Is it so important, may I interrupt, that there should be government support for the broadband service or the equipment needed at some point? Do you believe that it's essential in our society today?
I think if it's needs-based, it's essential. right? Because what I love about America, and I'm the fiercest free market guy you'll find, I do believe we have a collective responsibility to all our citizens that we've always been committed to, and in 100 years of communication policy, we always have. And I just think it's the right thing to do, just like we have a social safety net. We don't say, well, if you fall into this category, we just let you have no health care or no ability to take care of your child when they're sick, or we let you completely go hungry. We make some efforts to make sure people have that. So I think that we do, but I do think we should be more disciplined than we were last time around. Meaning, look, I don't need a subsidy. And the program has been clumsy in the way that it allocates these resources. And should a major wealthy ranch in the middle of Montana be subsidized for architecture and infrastructure? There would be a lot more money available if we would get better at targeting it to people who have genuine affordability needs or general issues of poverty or access to rural. I'd be a lot more comfortable and committed to that than I would just sort of these blanket, it's 7%, so let's spend a fortune subsidizing 7%. Last thing I would say is, I'm not a congressman, but our country's broke. And so we better be creative about this, because this isn't the Tennessee Valley Authority project. I don't think there's a big savior coming in the form of a massive check from the United States Congress to solve this problem. So we should at least sort of scope the problem realistically against what we have available.
The third leg of that gap is the spectrum, and that's a big theme around here, because all of this development of new services are turning us into a nation of broadband multitaskers. Yeah, we're envisioning a consumer who's watching TV and using applications on their iPad and might be tweeting about it at the same time, and all of that uses space. There's a big discussion here about fat pipes coming into the home, so much that people have said to me, I feel like I'm on a plumbing convention. But it's spectrum availability and spectrum use, and that's a big policy issue. What is the NCTA's position on how the spectrum should be managed to allow development?
Well, I think from the cable industry's perspective, it's pretty multifaceted, because unlike, say, the traditional wireless companies, who you have it's very linear to understand where they are, why they need more spectrum. We have a lot of diversity of experimentation going on in the cable industry. We have companies who have a quad play in which they're offering very traditional telephone-based wireless services in direct competition to an AT&T or a Verizon in their market. We have other companies who've made a choice that they're not that interested in being a terrestrial wireless telephone company, but yet they want mobility in their products and services, and they're more focused on Wi-Fi or on license, or being able to use wireless as a network conduit inside the home, so that you can walk around with that iPad, right? You don't want a long extension cord into something, right? To make it work, you've got to have spectrum, and you've got to have it in a way that allows that experience. And then maybe you want that experience outside the home to a degree. Maybe you want your own wireless network, or you want to roam on other people's wireless networks. We have every flavor of that going on in the cable industry. So it's hard to say we have a single-minded answer about these things. We do want to make sure we always have an opportunity to get access to spectrum, as it continues to be important. We do want the government to stay focused on the different uses of spectrum, some of which will be just as important to us, say like unlicensed and Wi-Fi, and not just licensed stuff that gets sold at auction. So we watch this. It's not our core issue, because there are a lot of people fighting more fiercely about it, but it's pretty important. And I think that in 10 years, I asked Chairman Janikowski today, do you think anybody can be without a wireless plan? And I think the right way to say it is, can anybody be without mobility? And I don't think so.
Are the days of spectrum auctions soon to be behind us?
You mean not going to happen anymore?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. It's a big boon to the government treasury, and I think one of the smartest communication policy choices ever made was the country got off of the other ways of allocating spectrum, lotteries, and giving them away to auctions. It's been very efficient. It's raised a lot of revenue. I think it's created the right way to allocate spectrum, and so I don't have any doubt that Congress will continue eventually to reauthorize spectrum auctions.
And how about to the broadcasters and completing the transition?
What about them?
Well, they've been, I mean, seriously, has the pace of this been appropriate? It seems as though it's taken a long time for this spectrum to be returned to the United States. The broadcasters have been using. We're not fully digital in the way that we envisioned on the timetable for over the air.
Yeah, you know, I mean, there's two parts. Depending on what you mean, there's two components to the question. I mean, part of it is we've had a, you know, a sort of long, tortuous HD TV transition.
Right.
And part of it's the complexity of making the transition. And by the way, we're not the only country. You know, I met with some Korean regulators this week, and you know, they're nervously moving toward a cutover also. I mean, the whole world sort of been working its way through this. I wish it had taken less time. But you know, when you start these things, this is my whole point about your question about the future and ambiguity. When Chairman Dick Wiley got into this and the country started focusing on HDTV, you could have never, in the wildest sci-fi movie, envisioned the way spectrum is being used today. On a smartphone, you would not have conceptualized Wi-Fi. A lot of this stuff that now has emerged as an alternate use wasn't there. So the HDTV transition was built around, it was totally TV-centric. It was all about just TV. It was just analog to digital TV. There was no notion that there was some other thing in the equation. That's emerged only more recently. And I think when the government now is looking at trying to get spectrum back because there's this, what they call higher and better use, that's a newer transition. And one that's hard for broadcasters to swallow. You know, though they're trying to work through it. They want to be part of the digital age too. So that's going to be hard, and for no other reason than it's complex and it's politically loaded, right? It's a lot of somebody's ox might get gored. Change does that sometimes, and that makes it hard.
Let me ask two more questions on the policy front with regard to spectrum management. One is net neutrality, an issue that's been around for a while now. You have said at this show, and this was a quote to an interview with Broadcasting and Cable, that net neutrality will become substantially less threatening. Right now there's a great deal of speculation around it. What were you saying?
Well, I find net neutrality a tough issue because it does involve an enormous amount of speculation. There was an enormous amount of evidence of the worst fears actually occurring. Everybody points to maybe 4 cases of things, and some of which I think are arguably violate the spirit of the principle or not. So it's this fear that somebody has an incentive to do things we would find inappropriate, and let's regulate in advance against that possibility. I think that when you're in the early periods of something new, a lot of times your anxieties and your fears run away with you a little bit, meaning it's easy to believe the worst will happen, and in my experience, rarely does the worst actually happen. I have long believed, and I still believe this today, that most network operators I know have no interest, have no incentive, do not have a real financial incentive, nor do they have a customer base that would tolerate doing the sorts of things that the most advocates of net neutrality would say they're poised to do. And I think that even if there were no rule, in my own view, even though we're sort of content that we reached a good place on this, I think you would find that the incentives of most of these companies would have not to be going in the direction that people had anxiety about. If you look through the history of the internet of attempts at kind of closed systems, systems that attempted to bias content in favor of their own, the road again is littered with those companies who tried those approaches, and the market caps of the companies that have had more open platforms has gone through the roof. The old AOL walled garden, the Microsoft network service, we could go on and on about closed, not accessing the internet spaces, and tell me the companies that have done that successfully, and then tell me about Google and Amazon and Yahoo and Facebook and Twitter. And I mean, at some point, the economics prove that you're operating at your peril to try to tell your customer they don't get to go where they want to go on the internet. And I just don't think that as a cold business decision, most of them are inclined to do those sorts of things.
A cousin or a corollary to that is tiering for higher end users might pay more. And in a session here, FTC Commissioner John Leibowitz said he's surprised it hasn't taken off more.
Yeah.
Will that be a marketplace decision about price tiering, or will it come from Washington?
I think it's going to be a marketplace decision. The FCC said explicitly in net neutrality that that kind of tiering, usage-based pricing, was okay. Even went so far as to say it may be the only fair way to manage the network. And we should say something about that. When we say fairness, you know, in a shared network in my neighborhood, the vast majority of my neighbors get email and surf web pages. Now, if one of my neighbors happens to be running a music server because they love music and they have 9,000 songs, that shouldn't mean I have a terribly degraded experience and I have to pay for it. And so economics is completely, what Chairman Leibowitz was saying is economics 101, which is the way markets deal with that problem is differentiated pricing. It's efficient. If you're the 20% that wants to run the music server, that's okay, but you should pay more for that consumption. And in part so that Mike Powell's family, who's only doing email and checking web pages, can pay less. And so he's surprised because he's an antitrust thinker, and I am too, and in antitrust scholarship we would say that's absolutely the efficient answer, right, to this problem. If there's a limited amount of capacity and you have to manage that scarcity and you have power users and less power users, the market answer is always the same, differentiate price. We do it and what he said today was, we do it every single other place in the economy. Right? We're about to put hot lanes in Washington, D.C., so that when the road is congested, if you're willing to pay, you get to go into a lane to go a little faster. And this is a government program. And if the road gets even more congested, they're going to charge you even more to go in the fast lane. And it's the exact same theory, right?
Or
Let's
most
manage.
People ride public transportation when it costs more during
And you make sure that the key is to make sure that the low end still has a choice, a meaningful choice.
Our time is running out pretty quickly.
Okay.
Your first year in this job will also be the lead up to an election.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what happens in Washington in the congressional arena and the regulatory arena for issues that you're now concerned about most. Is it going to be a period of a lot of activity, or you think that their heads are other places?
Well, 6 weeks into the job, I'm not sure I'm positive I know.
No,
but
you've
I would
gone
say
through
this.
election cycles before.
Yeah. I actually think our issues are not going to be front and center as we move into the election swirl, because I think the economic issues facing the country are profoundly serious. I mean, this isn't like kind of serious, it's the economy stupid. You know, this is really generationally serious. And, you know, in about a couple weeks, we're going to be in do or die over the debt ceiling. We're going to be in do or die over deficit politics. These are the issues, in my judgment, that are going to form the core of the 2012 election. And we're still getting a lot of attention on the Hill. I see a lot of congressmen, but they're consumed. I mean, they're almost overwhelmed with the magnitude of these sets of problems. And so, yeah, there's going to be communication stuff on the fringes. But I don't predict that we'll be in the core of any of these things, other than the ones that have real resonance that come out of the web, like, say, privacy maybe, or something that, you know, in the headlines because Facebook had a breach, or somebody has a breach.
The
you know.
Senate's own
the
computer
Senate
systems.
hackers, cybersecurity. That stuff may get a little attention.
Well, I have so many more questions, but I'm getting flagged that you've got to go on to other
we'll
things.
see you
so
again.
Please do come down and sit with us again.
Thank you so
Thanks
much,
for
and
your
we're
time.
proud of what you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Look for more interviews from The Cable Show in the coming weeks. You can find this and other Communicators programs at cspan.org.